Good morning, guys. Today we're going to be reading chapter 12 of Unbroken, which is, we're actually starting part 3. So congratulations if you've been listening along. We have gotten through the first 2 parts of the book. After part 3, we're going to watch, there was a Discovery Channel special that was done on Louie and Phil and the rest of the crew that survived, their survival in the Raft. So we are gonna, on one of our Google Meets, we're gonna watch the Discovery Channel Shark Week hour special on their survival. But anyway, we'll get to that when we're done with part 3. What we should be looking for this week, if you remember, is we're not just taking notes by chapter. We're taking notes focused on the central theme of the story or the central idea. The major theme that we've got so far that you should be looking for this week is determination and inner strength help people to overcome obstacles. So what you should see, and what you've seen in the past chapters more than likely, is you've seen examples of that. So like in chapter 8, there's 594 bullet holes in Superman, yet Phil keeps it flying. So he's determined, and so he's successful. So it's basically about inner strength and determination making people successful. Here's another example from chapter 9. This is a small one, but that Marine who saw all those natives going into the church, and he knew that it would be bombed, he goes in, he tries to get them out. They say no. He's determined, so he shoots his gun up in the air. He fires up, and it gets them to all scatter, and he ends up saving all of them. So that would be another example of how determination and inner strength help you overcome something. So it can be anything, any kind of obstacle that somebody has to overcome would be an example of this. Another part, which we saw in the last chapter, is Louie and Phil surviving the crash. Their plane crashes. One of the engineers accidentally hits the wrong feathering button, and instead of just one engine dying, 2 engines on the side die, and so the plane ends up going sideways and going into the ocean. But both of them are determined to make it. Phil ends up hitting his head, but he's so determined to get out that he ends up going through the front window after the glass breaks. And no, that was Phil. And then Louie, he's tangled up in those ropes attached to the gun, and he's determined to survive. So he ends up waking back up after the water pressure hits him wrong, and he wakes up, and he ends up, because he's so determined, he gets to the surface. So what we're starting with is we're starting with part 3, which is their journey in the raft. Okay, here we go. So chapter 12, Downed. And this is an example of a typical raft of what it looks like. If you notice, not much sitting room here. So if a man, think about if there's more than, one survivor, it would be a tight squeeze fitting in here together. Okay, so chapter 12, Downed. The ocean was a jumble of bomber remains. The plane's lifeblood, oil, hydraulic fluid, and some 1,000 gallons of fuel slopped on the surface. Louie heard a voice. He turned and he saw Mac and Phil far away clinging to the debris. Blood spouted in arcs from Phil's head. I don't know if you know what that means, but an arc is like a rainbow shape. So blood is spouting in arcs from Phil's head. So it was a bad head wound. And it streamed down his face. No one else had surfaced. Louie saw 2 rafts. The engineer, in his heroic last act of life, had apparently yanked the release handle just before he was killed. So that would be another example of determination. The engineer is determined to save everybody else. So he risks his life, but he's successful because the life rafts release. The rafts had inflated themselves and were drifting away rapidly. Louie knew that he had to stop Phil's bleeding, but if he lost the rafts, they would all perish. He swam for one of the rafts. His clothes weighed him down, and and the current and the wind carried the raft faster away than he could swim. As the raft slid hopelessly out of reach, Louie looked back at Phil and Mac, sharing the recognition that their chance was lost. So he looks back at them, and he's like, this is it. The raft's too far away. I can't swim to it. Then he saw a cord trailing behind the raft. So he thinks everything's lost, and then he looks down in the water, and there is a rope cord that is attached to the raft. So he grabs onto it. He snatched it, reeled the raft to him, and climbed aboard. He grabbed the oars, rowed to the second raft, and tied the two together. He rowed to Phil and Mac and pulled Phil aboard. Mac, uninjured, climbed up on his own. Both men, like Louie, were filmy with fuel and oil. With all three in one raft, ooh, think about it, remember? Think about how tiny this raft is. All three of them are in that raft. With all three of them in one raft, it was cramped. The raft interior was only about 6 feet long and a little more than 2 feet wide. There were 2 gashes on Phil's forehead, spurting blood. Louie ran his fingers down Phil's throat and felt a pulse, the carotid artery, and then he put Mac's hand on it and told him to press down. He pulled off his top shirt and t-shirt and pulled off Phil's shirts as well. He asked Mac to do the same. He folded Phil's shirt, pressed to the wounds, and then tied other shirts around his head. He slid Phil into the second raft. Phil felt woozy. As the pilot, he was in charge, but he was in no condition to make decisions, so he asked Louie to take command. "I'm glad it was you, Zamp," he said softly. From the water, there came a small moan, trailing off into a gargle and then silence. So they hear, the 3 of them are in that raft, and they hear somebody else come to the surface. Louie grabbed an oar and circled around, searching for the drowning man. But whoever had made that sound had slipped under, and he didn't come up again. 11 men had gone up in the Green Hornet, and all but 3 were dead. With Phil stable, Louie turned his attention to the 2 rafts. They were made of rubber-coated canvas divided into 2 air pockets. The critical issue was provisions. Provisions are food and water, supplies to survive. The provisions box, which Mac had been holding as the plane went down, was gone, ripped from his hands in the crash, or lost in the escape from the wreckage. In their pockets, the men had only wallets and coins. That's not going to help them in a raft. Their watches were still on their wrists, but the hands had stopped when the plane hit. Cece's bracelet was not on Phil's wrist, and his lucky silver dollar wasn't in his pocket. Maybe he'd forgotten them, or maybe they'd been lost in the crash. Whatever was in the raft pockets was all that they would have. In them, Louie found several chocolate bars, several pints of water, a brass mirror, a flare gun, sea dye, fish hooks, fishing line, a leak patching kit, and 2 air pumps with canvas cases. So who is the one, if you think about it, who is the one so far that is showing any kind of determination and inner strength to keep them going? Louie. So if you think about it, he's trying to make them be successful. He fixes the wound on Phil's head, and he's also going through all the provisions. He's going through and looking to see what they have, and they have chocolate bars, water, a brass mirror, a flare gun, sea dye, fish hooks, fishing line, a leak patching kit, and 2 pumps, so air pumps, so if something happens to their life raft. Okay. There was also a set of pliers with a screwdriver in the handle. Louie pondered it, wondering why anyone would need a screwdriver or pliers on a raft. That was all that was there. No knife, nothing for shelter, no fishnet, no radio. The most worrisome was their water situation. A few half pints wouldn't last very long. Because seawater is so salty, it's poisonous, they couldn't drink it. Yeah, fun fact, if you drink seawater, is poisonous to your system because of all the salt, and so it makes you end up seeing things that aren't there and going crazy if you drink it. So they all can't drink the seawater that's there. Adrift near the equator with little water, Phil, Louie, and Mac would soon be in dire trouble. Since the crash, Mac hadn't said a single word. He'd done everything Louie asked of him, but his face never lost that glazed, startled expression. This is Mac. Before the crash, of course. So he is not handling the crash well. Louie was assessing the rafts when Mac suddenly began wailing. "We're gonna die!" Louie tried to reassure him, but Mac kept shouting. Exasperated, Louie threatened to report Mac when they returned, but it didn't have any effect. At his wit's end, Louie whacked Mac's face with the back of his hand. Sorry, this way. Mac thumped back and fell silent. Louie established rules. Each man would eat 1 square of chocolate in the morning and 1 in the evening. Louie allotted 1 water tin per man, with each man being allowed to take 2 or 3 sips a day. So think about why he's doing this. He's trying to keep them, he's trying to keep their provisions lasting a long time. So 1 square of chocolate in the morning, 1 in the evening, and then only a couple of sips of water a day. Eating and drinking at this rate, they could stretch the supplies for a few days. There was nothing to do but wait. Louie's back hurt. The skin down the length of it had been scraped off as he escaped the wreckage, and he assumed that this was the source of his pain. But he had no idea that it was worse than that. He had been thrown into the gun mount as the plane struck the ocean, and at that point, every one of his ribs had broken. Whew. So he doesn't realize how bad off he is because he's taking care of everybody else, but all of his ribs are broken. Imagine how painful that is. Pushing away thoughts about the men who died, Louie pondered his escape from the wreckage. If he had passed out under the water pressure and the plane had continued to sink and the pressure build, why had he woken up again? And how had he been loosed from the wires while unconscious? He's like, why me? Why did I survive? I was tangled up, and then how did I wake up? And when I woke up, there was nothing on me, so how did that happen? The men watched the sky. Louie kept his hand on Phil's head, staunching the bleeding. So he's keeping his hand on Phil's head to keep pressure on it to keep it from bleeding. The last trace of the Green Hornet, a shimmer of gas, hydraulic fluid, and oil, faded away, and in its place, rising from below, came massive blue gliding shapes, circling in lithe arcs around the rafts. The sharks had found them. The sharks, which Louie thought were of the mako or reef species, were so close that the men could touch them, so they could lean out and touch them from the raft if they wanted. The smallest were about 6 feet long. Some were 12 feet. They bent around the rafts, testing the fabric, but not trying to get at the men. They seemed to be waiting for the men to come to them. The sun sank and it became sharply cold. The men used their hands to bail a few inches of water into each raft. Once their bodies warmed the water, they felt less chilled. They fought the urge to sleep, afraid that a ship or a submarine would pass and they would miss it. Phil was so cold that he shook. It was absolutely dark and absolutely silent, saving the chattering of Phil's teeth. The ocean was a flat calm. A rough, rasping tremor ran through the men. So there is dead quiet in the middle of the night. They can't see anything. The only thing they can hear is Phil's teeth chattering because he's so cold. And then all of a sudden they hear this reek, reek, reek. And it's the sharks. A rasping tremor ran through the men. The sharks were rubbing their backs along the rafts. So the sharks are coming so close that they're purposefully rubbing their backs on the raft. Louie's arm was still draped over the side of the raft, his hand resting on Phil's forehead. Phil drifted to sleep, feeling the sharks scraping down his back. In the next raft, Louie too fell asleep. But Mac lay awake. His mind was spinning with fear. Grasping at a panicked resolution, he began to stir. So, wonder what our friend Mac is going to do. So if we have this central idea, let's think about things that happen in this chapter that would add to our central idea. One thing that stands out to me where someone had inner strength would be when they crash, what does Louie do? So in chapter 12, and I'm putting myself a note here, so chapter 12, Louie is determined to save Phil. He stops his head wound from bleeding with his shirt. Okay, so I've got that right there that I've added from chapter 12. Let's think of another instance where somebody does not give up. What does Louie do to help them survive? He chases down the raft. He overcomes the obstacle of the raft being far away. And so chapter 12, I'm going to make a note there. Louie is determined to save himself and Phil and Mac. So what does he do? He rations out food, and he also, what else does he do? So he rations out food, he swims and gets the life raft. So those are both things. So 2 things that we could add from this chapter at least that show us determination and inner strength, helping them overcome things. So they overcome by surviving. They overcome because Louie is so determined and does all these things to keep them going. All right, guys. Well, I will talk to y'all later. Y'all have a good day, and I will talk to you soon. Miss y'all.